Hello ladies and gents, this is Patrick from MakeVirtualTours.com, and I want to bring you another video today about how to make virtual tours. But first I want to thank everybody who's been leaving comments and constructive criticism, especially the people who have been letting me know about how big my eyes get when I talk. I had no idea that this was even an issue, so thanks so much to everybody who brought it up. In this video we're going to talk about taking the actual photographs that we need to create the panorama. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty, talking about the camera settings. So if you don't know anything about how your camera actually works, aperture, shutter speed, etc., I recommend taking a break, checking out some other YouTube videos, and learning about the actual process of how to operate your camera. Once we discuss that, we're going to go over how we actually use this thing. This is the Know-It-All head. So we're going to go into the details about how this thing works and how we're actually going to operate it depending on what type of camera lens we have. Then we're going to take the photos, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have a better understanding about how the actual shooting of the virtual tour takes place. Alright, let's talk about the camera settings that we're going to use. Now keep in mind, all these images that we take are going to need to be combined into a single panorama. So that means that we're going to need to keep them consistent as possible in terms of the exposure and the color temperature that we use. So that means we're going to put our camera on full manual mode. Next, let's talk about the exposure that we're going to use. So when we shoot a room, we might have a really bright window on one side and a really dark corner on the other side. And since it's a full 360, we're going to have to account for both the brightness and the darkness in a scene. So really it comes down to setting an exposure that gives you the best of both worlds and also shooting HDRs. Now, when we talk about the aperture, we're looking at somewhere around f11. I would say that hits a sweet spot between giving you the maximum depth of field that you need and also minimizing the diffraction that you get if you stop all the way down to like f16 or f22. So then we're going to have to look at our ISO and our shutter speed from that point on, and I generally don't want to have my shutter going all the way down to 5 seconds or something like that, because first of all, it'll take forever, and secondly, it'll eat up a lot of battery if I'm shooting so many pictures just having these long exposures. So, you know, it depends on your scene, obviously, but I'm probably looking at shooting, you know, at 1/10 of a second as my baseline, and then starting somewhere around 640 ISO. Obviously, that's a give and take, and if you have a newer camera that was made after, say, 2013, you shouldn't have any issues with pushing up the ISO a little bit higher than that, but it's all really your call and knowing what works best with your camera. So on this camera, for example, right now in the scene that I'm at, I'm shooting at 1/3 of a second at f11, and then my ISO is at 640. Okay, and that should give me the exposure that I need. Now let's talk about the white balance. Again, the white balance is going to be on manual mode, and you're going to want to keep it the same for the entire scene just to keep that consistency across the color range. And what is going to be the ideal white balance? Well, it really depends on the room that you're shooting in. Now, if you're shooting in a room that's dominated by warm orange tungsten bulbs, then you're going to want to go towards that end of the spectrum. However, if you're shooting in a room with a lot of windows, that's your primary light source, you're going to want to put it on the daylight end of the spectrum. Now, usually I sort of just evaluate, all right, I've got predominantly warm, but I've definitely got some daylight coming in. So that means that I'm probably going to be looking at a white balance of around 4,000 Kelvin. And the good thing about shooting raw is if I do decide later on that I didn't hit it quite out of the park, then I will go back and change the white balance on all of my images in Lightroom. Cool, so once we get all those settings dialed in, the last thing we're going to have to do is get ready for bracketing. Now, when we shoot these virtual tours, we're doing an HDR. This means that we are taking 3 photos of the same exact scene, then merging them together. So we're going to take one at the proper exposure, one photo overexposed, then another underexposed, and then merge those all together later on in our post-processing workflow. So if you have a lower end camera, there's a possibility that you may have to do this manually. However, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to assume that you have a mid-range to high-end camera and assume that you have a bracketing button just like mine. So I press this button right here, then I turn my dial so that I'm taking 3 photos, one of which is 2 stops overexposed, and another of which is 2 stops underexposed, and then the last is properly exposed. And the last thing that I want to make sure that I have turned on is the self-timer mode. What this does is it allows me to press the shutter one time, count off 5 seconds, then take 3 photos back to back to back, which will give me that set of bracketed photos automatically. All right, we've got our settings dialed in and we are ready to get started with taking our pictures. But before we do that, I just want to go over the logistics of how we're going to cover the full 360 degrees by 180 degrees of our scene. Now, in my case, I am using a 10.5 millimeter fisheye lens on a crop frame sensor. And what that means is that I'm covering approximately 60 degrees with every shot. So I will need to take 6 sets of bracketed pictures to cover the horizontal 360 degrees. Then, in order to get the ceiling, I'll need 2 sets of bracketed photos with the camera pointed straight up. Next, I'll turn the camera around so it's facing straight down and get 2 sets of bracketed photos of the floor with the camera on the tripod. And lastly, I'll remove the camera from the tripod and take one single handheld shot of the floor. If you're using a wider lens, say an 8mm circular fisheye lens, then you will probably need to take less photos to cover your scene. Then on the other end of the spectrum, if you're using a normal non-fisheye lens, you'll probably need to take a lot more. Your Pano head will come with a series of interchangeable rings, and these rings have notches in them that allow you to turn your camera a set number of degrees. Now, the number of degrees that you turn the camera between each shot depends on how wide your lens is. So one last thing that I should mention is you want to have your camera be as level as possible. So there's a bubble level, and what I do to make sure that it's in the right place, that everything's level, is I rotate it around and I just make sure that that bubble is just sitting there right in the center for every angle. And if I need to make any adjustments, I'll maybe lower a leg of the tripod just a tiny little bit. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and take these pictures. And here we go. The first one is, like I mentioned, going to be on a timer. So I'll just press a button and let it do its thing. It's going to take 3 pictures and they're going to be slightly different exposures for each one. All right, looks good. So let's keep on doing that. And I'll go ahead and speed it up. We've covered our entire 360 degrees of the horizontal field of view. So now what we need to do is make sure we take pictures of the ceiling and the floor. In order to do that, I'm going to loosen the knob on the right-hand side and then flip my camera straight up. Now, I'm gonna have to duck down for this because if I'm actually standing up here, I'm gonna be in the picture, which isn't really ideal for any of the clients. Nobody wants to see me in the pictures. So I will go ahead and hit the button, still got the same settings on, and let it rip. Great. Now, instead of turning it another 60 degrees, I'm going to make sure that it's turned 90 degrees. This will give me the most coverage of the horizontal area. And here we go again, one last time. And we have liftoff. All right. The last part of the virtual tour shooting process is taking photos of the ground. So what we're gonna do is actually flip this camera around and we're gonna take 2 pictures while the camera's still on the tripod facing straight towards the ground. Then we're going to remove the camera from the tripod. We're gonna try to remember exactly where it was and hold the camera out with our arm and just take pictures of the ground with no tripod. What this will do is, for the person who's looking at the virtual tour, they're not gonna see any tripod. It's just gonna be as if they're looking straight down to the ground and kind of floating in space there. When we are stitching our panorama together, occasionally we have issues with getting the floor to match up with the rest of our panorama. And the reason for this is because usually the floor will be very nondescript. So in order to reduce the headache that we have on the back end side of things, I will sometimes put 3 distinct objects on the ground, which make matching my floor to the rest of my panorama a lot easier. These are generally really small things that I can put down in a triangular pattern, and In this case, I've got a leaf, I've got a little ring, and I've got a set of keys. And this will, trust me, simplify my life so much in the future when I know that I get back to my computer and I'm trying to match the floor and bring it into the rest of the panorama, and I just can't find anything on the ground that really matches. And the reason why I choose small objects is so that I can easily Photoshop them out later. So here we go. I'm gonna just go ahead and put these three things down here. Got a leaf here, got the ring on this corner, and we've got our keys over here. And the last thing we need to do is just flip our camera around. I'm doing it the exact same way that I did earlier. And I love photobombing you guys in this video here. Taking the three pictures, once again, same situation, same settings, and then stepping out. Our final photo is going to be a handheld shot of the ground. As you may remember, my shutter speed is at 1/3 of a second. I'm going to have to obviously increase that shutter speed in order to make the photos not have any motion blur while I'm shooting handheld. So I'm probably going to go ahead and bump that down to 1/20th of a second or so and open up my aperture a little bit and perhaps boost the ISO. This last photo will not be in HDR, so we can turn off the bracketing and then also turn the camera from self-timer mode to single shot mode. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the camera from the tripod, and I will move the tripod out of the way. And one thing worth mentioning as I'm doing this is that you should try to keep the camera when you take this last photograph in the same spot that you had it in before. Disregard that. When you keep the camera in the same spot, it'll just make the stitching a lot more seamless later on. However, if we do have a little bit of a perspective shift, it's not the end of the world. So let's go ahead and take this last photo. All right, that's it. So I wanted to thank everybody for watching this video. I really hope that you learned something. If you guys are interested in learning even more about how to make virtual tours, please subscribe here and go check out makevirtualtours.com. I've got tons of in-depth text tutorials, information about the software and the camera gear that you need, and loads of other fun stuff. So thanks so much for watching and have a good one.